The fence was splintered, but that was nothing, not compared to her heart. When a silent man with calloused hands came to fix the boards, Nora's daughter stood barefoot in the wet grass and whispered a question that shattered the morning quiet. "Could you fix Mama too?" He didn't knock. He didn't introduce himself. He just appeared one morning, as if the sunrise had brought him. Sawdust already clinging to his sleeves, a hammer heavy in his belt, and a gaze so far off it felt like he was trying to erase himself from the landscape. The storm had been cruel. It tore through her small plot of land like a wild animal, leaving the fence leaning like a row of drunkards, the gate hanging from a single rusted hinge. Nora had thought about fixing it. She'd stood on the porch, the baby heavy on her hip, and stared at the damage. But the grief of the last 4 years had hollowed her out. Lifting a hammer felt like trying to lift a mountain. The sorrow was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, stealing the strength from her arms. So when the man arrived, silent as dusk, she just watched. Her youngest, Clara, was the first to speak. She tugged on Nora's skirt, her small voice a mix of awe and worry. "Mama," she whispered, "there's a man fixing our fence." Nora shaded her eyes against the sun. He was on his knees, his movements rhythmic and sure. Tap, tap, tap. Each strike of the hammer was precise, economical. He never once looked toward the house. She didn't recognize him. He wasn't from town, not from the church, not from the mill. He was just a tall, sun-worn man with arms that looked like they could bend iron, and a back that looked like it had carried the world. "Sir?" she called out, her voice feeling thin in the open air. He didn't answer. He just reached for another board and kept hammering. For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then he paused. He stood up, slow and deliberate, and turned. He didn't smile. He just tipped his hat in a brief, almost reluctant gesture. His eyes, they were kind, but they were burdened, weighed down by something she couldn't name. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he turned back to his work. And something inside Nora, something that had been clenched tight for 4 years, eased just a fraction. She didn't mind the silence. In a world full of pitying words and empty condolences, his silence felt honest. It felt safe. He came every morning for the rest of the week. At sunrise, he was there. By noon, a section of the fence was straight and strong. He worked without stopping, without speaking. Nora tried. She offered him coffee one morning. He just nodded, took the mug, and sipped it by the old tree stump, his face tight as if tasting something warm was a painful memory. She sent Clara out with a bundle of sweetbread another day. He accepted it with that same solemn nod, eating it quickly before resuming his work. He didn't flinch when her 2 boys came tumbling out of the house, shouting and wrestling in the dust. He didn't even blink when Clara tripped and bloodied her knee. He just stopped what he was doing, walked over, and picked her up. He dusted off her dress with his large, rough hands, then set her gently on her feet. He looked at Nora and nodded again, a simple message passing between them. "I've got her." It was on the last day, as he was fixing the gate, that Clara approached him. She stood there, her small hands gripping the newly set post, her head tilted as she looked up at him. She had a way of looking at people, with eyes that seemed to pull truth from stone. "You fixed our fence," she said, her voice clear as a bell. He stopped, hammer in his hand. "Could you fix my mama's heart too?" The world seemed to stop. The hammer in his hand froze mid-swing. He didn't look at Clara. He didn't look at the house. He just stood there, a statue carved from wood and grief. Nora was in the doorway, and she felt the question like a physical blow, like he'd swung that hammer right into her ribs. She opened her mouth to call Clara back, to apologize for the innocent cruelty of a child's question, but no words came out. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears. He lowered the hammer, slowly, carefully, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. Clara didn't move. She just waited, her faith in him absolute. Without a word, He finished nailing the last board on the hinge. He tested the gate, swinging it open and closed. It moved silently, perfectly. He straightened the post, and then he walked away. He didn't look back. He just walked down the road and disappeared around the bend, leaving behind a fixed fence and a heart that felt more broken than ever. Nora didn't sleep that night. She'd known loss. Her husband Holden had been gone for 4 years. Not dead, just gone. He'd saddled up one morning, kissed her cheek, and said he'd be back by nightfall. She'd made his favorite stew. She'd put on her best dress. The stew cooled on the stove. The dress wrinkled as she sat waiting on the porch. The sun went down. The moon came up. He never returned. No note. No goodbye. Just an emptiness that echoed louder than any shout. The townspeople talked, of course. Their whispers followed her through the general store. Maybe he'd been killed on the trail. Maybe he'd run off with that woman who sold cloth down by the square. Maybe he'd just gotten tired of the land, tired of the dust, tired of her. But Nora knew. In her bones, she knew. He'd left because her grief had made her heavy. Her laughter had gone brittle. She cried into her pillow at night and forgot to put sugar in his coffee in the morning. He hadn't wanted a ghost for a wife. And for 4 years, that's what she'd been. Just a ghost moving through the motions, feeding mouths, mending clothes, changing sheets. A ghost with a spine made of pure necessity. But the man who fixed her fence... He hadn't laughed at Clara's question. He hadn't scolded her. He had frozen. As if her words hadn't just struck Nora, but had cracked something wide open inside of him too. The next morning, he didn't come, nor the next. A week passed. The gate was straight. The fence was sturdy. There was no reason for him to return. Nora tried to forget him. She tried to forget the weight of his silence, the strength in his back, the way Clara's small head had fit perfectly beneath his hand, as if it belonged there. She tried, but she failed. Then one evening, just as dusk was settling over the fields, Clara vanished. Nora had only stepped inside to check the stew. 3 minutes. 5 at the most. The boys were still in the yard, playing marbles by the porch steps. But Clara's spot was empty. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced Nora's chest. She ran out, barefoot, hair coming undone. "Clara!" She searched the well, the barn, the road. Nothing. The boys hadn't seen where she'd gone. Panic began to claw at her throat, and then she saw them. Footprints. Tiny bare footprints leading away from the yard, toward the dark line of the woods. She didn't think. She just ran. The woods were a tangled mess of shadow and thorn. Branches tore at her arms. Thorns snagged her dress. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp. But she followed those tiny prints, deeper and deeper, past, where the familiar trees gave way to ancient oaks, and the sky darkened to a bruised purple. She was about to scream Clara's name again when she heard it. A voice. Low and rough, like stones tumbling in a riverbed. It was a man's voice, reading. She stumbled through a thicket of ferns and into a small, hidden clearing, and she stopped dead. There, on a log beside a tiny, ramshackle cabin, sat Clara. She was tucked against the silent man's side, fast asleep. He had a book open on his lap, and his voice was barely a whisper against the sound of the wind. He wasn't reading fairy tales. He was reading scripture, psalms. His voice was raw, but it was steady, a lifeline in the growing dark. Nora stepped forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He looked up, startled. His eyes widened when he saw her. He rose slowly, carefully, lifting the sleeping Clara into his arms as if she were made of spun glass. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know she'd—" "She's all right," he said. It was the first time she'd heard him speak. His voice was even deeper than she'd imagined, rough but gentle. He walked toward her, moving with a strange caution, as if she were a wounded animal he was afraid of startling. When he reached her, he passed Clara into her arms. The warmth of the child was a comfort, a solid, living thing against her own trembling. He stepped back, putting a safe distance between them. "Why didn't you come back?" The question tumbled out of her before she could stop it. He looked down at his worn boots. "Didn't think I should." "Because of what she said?" He nodded once. The movement was stiff, pained. "I didn't tell her to say that," Nora whispered, clutching Clara tighter. "I know." The silence stretched between them, but this time it was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken things, with the rustle of leaves and the far-off hoot of an owl. "I lost someone," he said finally, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. 3 winters back. Nora held her breath. "I'm sorry. She was everything," he said, and the simple words held a universe of pain. "I tried to keep going, built this cabin, chopped wood, ate alone, but it didn't help." Nora nodded slowly, her own eyes burning with tears. "I came to fix the fence," he admitted, "because I needed something to fix." "Clara didn't mean to hurt you," Nora said. "She didn't," he agreed. His gaze lifted, meeting hers in the dim light, and in his eyes, she saw her own loneliness reflected back at her. She misses having someone." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "Don't we all?" She should have turned and gone home. She should have said thank you and walked away. But her feet felt rooted to the ground. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt safe. "Will you walk us back?" she asked softly. He nodded. He walked beside her through the dark woods, not speaking, not touching, but his presence was a steady, solid thing. She listened to the crunch of twigs under his boots, the soft sound of Clara's breathing, and the slow, tentative beat of her own heart, waking up after 4 long years of sleep. When they reached the edge of the clearing, by the fence he had mended, he stopped. "Nora," he said, and the sound of her name in his rough voice made her shiver. "I'm sorry I left." "You didn't," she said, turning to face him. "You were just quiet." A faint smile touched his lips for the first time. It was a sad, crooked thing, but it transformed his face. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes searched hers, looking for something she couldn't name. "Only if I'm wanted." "You are," she said, and turned toward her house before he could see the tears that were threatening to fall. Behind her, the quiet man stood in the darkness, watching her go as if she were a sunrise he never expected to see again. He came at dawn. He didn't knock, didn't call out. He just stood by the fence, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, watching the frost melt off the gate he'd repaired. Nora saw him through the kitchen window. She was whisking eggs with one hand, the baby balanced expertly on her hip with the other. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him so soon. Or maybe deep down, she had. Maybe that's why she'd put on her good apron that morning without even knowing why. He waited, his head bowed against the chill. When Clara saw him, she let out a cry of pure joy. Her spoon clattered to the floor as she shot up from her chair. "He's back!" she shouted, and bolted out the door before Nora could say a word. She threw herself at him, hugging his knees with a fearlessness that was so purely Clara. He crouched down to her level, still saying nothing, just looking at her with those soft, sad eyes and giving a single nod. Then his gaze rose, slow and deliberate, to meet Nora's. She had stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the baby still tucked against her hip. She didn't speak either, not at first. She just looked at him, and the look was a question she was still too afraid to ask out loud. He broke the silence. "You came," he said. "You asked," she replied. The words were simple, but they hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "I made coffee," she said, and it was an invitation. He hesitated for only a second, then stepped through the gate. The house wasn't much. The kitchen table was old and scarred, one leg shorter than the others, so the salt shaker always slid downhill. Her cups were a mismatched collection of chipped china and thick pottery. But she set out what she had. She buttered the cornbread and folded the cloth napkins like it was the most important meal of her life. He sat across from her, his back straight, his hat resting on his knee. He seemed to fill the small space, his presence a quiet, grounding force. The boys were still half-dressed and bouncing around, but he didn't seem to mind the chaos. The baby burbled happily. Clara, bold as ever, climbed right onto his lap as if she'd been doing it her whole life. He let her, his large hand resting carefully on her back to steady her. It was Clara, of course, who broke the fragile peace. "Are you going to marry my mama?" Nora choked on her coffee. Caleb's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Clara!" Nora gasped, mortified. "Well," the little girl reasoned, completely unbothered, "you fixed our fence, and you read me stories, and you came back. That's what papas do." He didn't answer, but Nora saw something flicker across his face. Not amusement, not shock, something older and sadder, something that looked almost like fear. "I'm so sorry," Nora muttered, reaching to pull Clara off his lap. "No," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. He gently stopped her hand. "She's all right." His voice did something to her. It was like thunder from a long way off, a promise of rain after a drought. "You never told us your name," she said, desperate to change the subject. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady and searching. "It's Caleb." "Caleb," she repeated softly. The name felt right, solid, dependable. The morning turned into afternoon. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. He moved through the day with a quiet competence that soothed Nora's frayed nerves. He helped her lift the heavy water bucket from the well. He carried in a load of kindling from the woodshed. He even tightened the squeaky hinges on the chicken coop door. He never asked what needed doing. He just saw and did. Nora watched him. She noticed the steadiness of his hands, the way he checked each job twice to make sure it was done right. She noticed how he wiped his boots meticulously on the mat before stepping onto the porch, as if entering her home was a sacred act. And every time he looked at her, something in her chest pulled tight, a feeling she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. By sundown, she offered him supper. He didn't answer right away. He just looked down at his boots, as if he didn't trust himself to accept, as if kindness was a language he was no longer fluent in. "You don't have to," she added quickly, her own courage faltering. "I know," he said, his voice low, "but I'd like to." The meal was simple, potatoes, cornbread, and beans. But as she set a place for him at the head of the table, the spot that had been empty for 4 years, it felt like a feast. The children were quiet for once, as if they instinctively understood that this was a holy moment. Caleb bowed his head. "Grace," he said, his voice soft but sincere. And for the first time in years, Nora bowed her head and believed that someone else's prayer could cover her too. After the meal, as he rose to leave, she offered to walk him to the gate. They stood there in the moonlight, the air smelling of hay and damp earth. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shared space instead of a void. "Why did you really come back, Caleb?" she asked, her arms crossed against the chill. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because I didn't want to leave," he finally said. Her heart beat a little harder. "I lost my wife," he continued, his voice thick with old pain. 5 years ago now. We were trying for children. God never gave us any. I thought maybe if I built enough things, fixed enough broken things, I could stop remembering how empty my arms are." She swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "They don't seem empty." He met her eyes then, and the look in them stole her breath. Not anymore. The wind whispered through the trees, a lonely sound. Her fingers brushed against his by accident, a spark of warmth in the cool night air. Neither of them moved away. "You don't have to fix anything else," she whispered. His voice cracked. "I want to." He left her there under the moon, and she watched him walk down the road, his silhouette fading into the darkness. She stood there for a long time, her heart fuller than it had been in years, a fragile hope taking root in the barren soil of her soul. But peace, like a spring thaw, can be deceitful. It can make you forget that winter isn't truly over. 2 days later, the sheriff arrived. He rode up in a cloud of dust, the tension in his jaw visible even from the porch. Nora met him there, holding the baby, a sense of foreboding already settling in her stomach. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. It wasn't a friendly greeting. It was official. "Need to ask you a few things." "What's wrong, Sheriff? Been seeing a man out here? Tall fella, quiet, maybe mid-40s. Her breath caught in her throat. "Why?" "Got a report from Pine Hollow. A widow woman down there says a man matching his description has been poking around her property. Says he's harmless, but odd. Just shows up. Fixes things. Doesn't speak much." Nora's grip on the baby tightened. "That doesn't sound like a crime." "Didn't say it was," the sheriff replied, his eyes hard. "But folks get uneasy. A man shows up out of nowhere, starts fixing things that ain't his to fix. It makes people nervous." He paused, letting his words sink in. "There's more, Nora. Before Pine Hollow, there were whispers from up north. A string of small towns. A silent man who appears, does odd jobs for widows and lone women, and then vanishes. Some say he's a guardian angel. Others say he's running from something." A chill went down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "He's not bothering anyone. He's been helping me." "He got a name?" "Caleb," she said, the name feeling foreign on her tongue now, laced with doubt. The sheriff nodded slowly as if the name confirmed something he already suspected. "Just keep your eyes open, Nora. Some men carry their grief like dynamite. Looks harmless right up until it blows." He tipped his hat again and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unanswered questions behind him. That night, Nora waited. She left the lamp burning in the window, a beacon in the darkness. But Caleb didn't come. By morning, Clara was asking for him. The boys were restless. The house felt too big, too empty. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt like an accusation. By afternoon, Nora couldn't stand it anymore. She saddled the old mule and rode out. She followed the familiar path through the woods, her heart pounding with a desperate hope. She had to know. She had to understand what the sheriff meant. When she reached the clearing, it was empty. The door to the small cabin hung open. The woodpile was half chopped, the axe resting against a log. The fire pit was cold, filled with gray ash. He was gone. Again. She stepped inside, her boots echoing on the rough floorboards. The single room smelled of pine and dust and loneliness. A Bible lay open on the small table, and beside it, a folded scrap of paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the neat, careful script. "I didn't mean to make a home where I wasn't invited. Thank you for letting me remember what warmth feels like. I won't forget." That was it. No explanation. No promise to return. Just a goodbye that felt like a door slamming shut. Nora sank onto the hard wooden stool, the note clutched in her hand, tears finally blurring her vision. She stayed there until the baby stirred in her arms, a small whimper that brought her back to reality. She tucked the note into her pocket, gathered her coat, and stepped back out into the cold, empty clearing. Clara would have questions, the boys would too, and Nora had no answers for them. But as she started the long walk home, deep down, beneath the crushing weight of the ache in her chest, a stubborn little ember of something else flickered. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something fiercer. It was defiance. Because the man who fixed her fence had almost fixed her heart, and she wasn't going to let some ghost from his past or some nervous sheriff break it again. The days after Caleb disappeared were long and gray. They dragged by like boots pulling through deep snow. Clara took to sitting by the gate every afternoon, her chin resting on her small hands, her eyes fixed on the bend in the road. She never said his name, but Nora knew who she was waiting for. Nora tried to fill the silence. She hummed while she cooked, told the boys extra stories at night, laughed a little too loudly at their antics. But it was a hollow performance. Every time she opened the apron drawer and saw that folded piece of paper, the laughter died in her throat. It was too sacred to throw out, too painful to read again. A week passed, then two. The world was slowly turning towards winter. Then, on a morning when frost traced silver patterns on the window panes, she found it. A bundle, tied neatly with twine, sitting at the edge of the yard. There were no footprints in the frost-covered grass leading to it. No sound had woken her in the night. It was just there. A quiet offering left at the border of her world. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she cautiously approached it. She knelt and picked it up. It was heavy. She unwrapped the rough burlap. Inside, her breath caught. A sack of good flour, a tin of expensive tea, and 3 small, wooden carvings. Her knees went weak, and she sank onto the cold porch steps, clutching the carvings to her chest. They were perfect. One was a likeness of Daniel, his mischievous grin captured in the grain of the wood. One was her other boy, Samuel, with his serious expression. The last one was Clara, down to the wild curls that framed her face. He had come in the night. He had stood out there, in the cold and the dark, watching her house. He hadn't been able to stay away, but he hadn't been able to stay either. She didn't tell the children. She let them keep hoping in their own way, without feeding a fire that might only burn out again. But that night, she put the lamp back in the windowsill, and before she went to bed, she looked out toward the dark line of trees, just once. Winter came down hard. The snow piled up in deep drifts, isolating them. The roof sprang a leak over the pantry. The old mule threw a shoe. It was too much work for one woman, but Nora kept going. She had always kept going. Then, one night in the middle of a sleet storm, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't the loud, official knock of the sheriff. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a soft, hesitant sound, almost apologetic. Holding her breath, she lit the lamp and pulled the door open, half expecting to see nothing but the swirling storm. But he was there, Caleb, soaked to the bone, his beard untrimmed and dusted with ice, his coat heavy with sleet. He stood just past the threshold, looking like a ghost returned from a long journey. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice a raw whisper against the wind. The lamp flame flickered between them, casting long, dancing shadows. The baby started to cry in the next room. "I can't offer you anything," she said finally, her own voice trembling. "Not even certainty." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Then we're even." She stepped aside, opening the door wider. He didn't move. "I'm not whole, Nora," he added, his voice cracking. "I'm not sure I ever will be. The things the sheriff heard, they're true. I've been running, not from the law, from myself. Every time I start to feel something, I run. But I know how to build. I know how to repair things. I just don't know if I'm any good at loving again." Her voice was barely audible. "I don't need perfect, Caleb. I just need someone who won't leave when things get cracked." They stood there in the doorway, the storm raging around them, the world seeming to hold its breath. Then, a small figure barreled past Nora. It was Clara, her nightgown dragging on the floor, her hair a tangled mess. "You came back!" she shouted, throwing her arms around Caleb's soaking wet legs. His breath hitched. He looked down at the small girl clinging to him, and something in his face broke. The hardness, the fear, it all just seemed to melt away. "I came back," he whispered, and reached down to rest a hand on her head. Nora closed the door softly behind him, shutting out the storm. That night, he slept on the floor by the fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The boys, sensing a shift in the universe, curled up on their own blankets near him like puppies seeking warmth. Nora sat in the rocking chair, the baby asleep in her arms, and watched the flames dance. She wondered if she was a fool for letting him back in, for daring to hope again. But as dawn broke, painting the windows in shades of gray and pink, and she saw him there, sleeping peacefully in her home, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't just hope. It was peace. Caleb stayed. He didn't move in, not officially. There were no labels, no discussions. He just never left again. One day bled into the next, and his presence became a part of the house's rhythm. He slept by the fire, rose at dawn, and filled his days with work. He fixed the mule's shoe. He patched the leaky roof. He rebuilt the entire chicken coop, making it sturdier than before. And every evening, he would sit on the porch steps, whittling small animals out of scraps of kindling, telling the children quiet stories as the sun went down. Slowly, the house began to heal. The boys started calling him Uncle Caleb. Clara, however, was clearly waiting for the right moment to call him something else entirely. Nora let the moments unfold naturally. She didn't push. She didn't question. She watched him, and her heart, which she thought had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, began to knit itself back together. She didn't need a man to fix her. She was realizing that now. She had survived 4 years on her own. She was strong. What she needed was a partner. Someone to stand beside her, not in front of her. One night, she was washing dishes, her back to the room, when she looked up and saw his reflection in the dark window pane. He was on the porch, patiently and gently brushing Clara's tangled hair. The sight was so simple, so tender, it made her ache. She leaned against the window frame and just watched. This was what family was. Not grand declarations, but these quiet, unassuming moments of care. Then came the letter. It arrived with a traveling circuit rider, tucked into a dusty satchel. It was addressed to her, from a cousin she barely remembered. She unfolded the brittle paper. The cousin's name was Rebecca, and her words were a torrent of desperation. She'd lost her husband, she wrote. She was drowning in debt from their ranch 2 towns over. She begged Nora for help, not money, just a place to stay, a refuge until she could get back on her feet. Nora showed the letter to Caleb that night. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "You want her to come here?" he asked finally. "I don't know her well," Nora admitted, "but she's blood, and she's alone." He looked at her, and his eyes were full of a deep understanding. "So were you," he said softly. The next morning they took the wagon to fetch Rebecca. But something was wrong from the moment they met her. She was younger than Nora remembered, and dressed far too finely for a woman who claimed to be destitute. Her eyes, sharp and restless, kept flitting towards Caleb. Her laugh was a shade too loud, a little too bright, especially when he spoke. Nora pushed her unease aside. She gave Rebecca the spare bed, shared her food, and treated her with the kindness she would want in the same situation. But within days, a subtle poison began to seep into the harmony of the house. Rebecca started telling the children stories that contradicted each other. She claimed to have traveled widely, but her hands were soft and uncalloused. She said she was used to ranch work, but she recoiled when Clara tried to hand her a newborn chick. And worst of all, she was constantly finding reasons to be alone with Caleb. "Oh, let me help you with that firewood, Caleb. I just love the smell of sawdust. Reminds me of my dear departed daddy. Has anyone ever told you that you have the kindest eyes?" Nora said nothing. She folded her laundry with tighter fists. She stirred the soup with more force than was necessary. She watched, and she waited. The breaking point came one night, after the children were asleep. The wind was howling outside, rattling the shutters. Nora stepped onto the porch for a breath of fresh air and found them. Rebecca was standing far too close to Caleb, her hand resting intimately on his arm. "I think we'd make a fine team, you and I," Rebecca was saying, her voice a low purr. "I know Nora's been through so much, poor dear, but you deserve someone who still knows how to smile, don't you think?" The creak of the floorboard under Nora's foot made them both jump. "I do know how to smile," Nora said, her voice dangerously even. "I just don't do it for show." Rebecca's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Caleb stepped back, pulling his arm away. "I think it's time you left," Nora continued, her voice as steady as stone. Rebecca's eyes narrowed into slits. "You'd throw out your own kin? In the middle of winter?" "I'd throw out anyone who tries to gut the only peace this house has known in years." Rebecca let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "Peace? You call this peace? Living with a silent, broken man who showed up out of nowhere? He's not yours, Nora. You think fixing a fence and warming your hearth makes him yours? You don't even know who he is." "I know what I see," Nora said quietly. "And I see a man who showed up when no one else did, who stayed when it was hard, who's healed more than just broken hinges around here." Caleb hadn't spoken. He just stood there watching Nora, a strange expression on his face. It was awe. He stepped forward then, moving past Rebecca as if she weren't there, and reached for Nora's hand. "I'm not looking for a partner who tries to outshine the darkness," he said, his voice low and firm, his eyes locked on Nora's. "I'm looking for someone who knows how to sit with it." His hand closed around hers, strong and sure. "I'm home," he said, and the words were a vow. Rebecca was gone by morning. The children didn't ask why. For the first time in a long, long time, Nora's heart stopped bracing for the next disappointment. She felt the ground solid beneath her feet. But just as they began to settle into this new, fragile peace, the sheriff returned. This time, he wasn't alone. And the man riding behind him, his face a mask of smug arrogance, was someone Nora had prayed she would never see again. It was Holden, her husband, Clara's father. Holden reined in his horse right beside the gate Caleb had fixed, his muddy boots just inches from the sturdy post. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the property before landing on Nora. A cruel smirk played on his lips. "Heard my little girl's been calling someone else Papa," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Before Nora could even react, Caleb moved. He stepped off the porch and placed himself directly between Holden and the house, a silent, unmovable wall. "You need to leave," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it had the weight of granite. Holden sneered. "Now, son, I don't think you're in a position to be giving orders. She's my daughter. I've got rights." But then Holden's eyes narrowed. He stared at Caleb, the smirk fading from his face, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then dawning recognition. "Wait a minute," Holden breathed. "I know you." A cold dread washed over Nora. What did he mean? How could Holden possibly know Caleb? Caleb's stance didn't change, but Nora saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. You were at Black Creek," Holden said, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. "The work camp, the silent one, the one they all called Preacher, 'cause you never said a word, just stared at everyone with those judging eyes." Nora's world tilted on its axis. A work camp, a prison camp. The sheriff's words came rushing back. "Some men carry grief like dynamite." "You lost those rights the day you left," Nora said, finding her voice, stepping forward to stand beside Caleb. She would not let him face this alone. "You left us hungry and scared. You don't get to ride back in here now that we're finally all right." The sheriff, who had been watching silently, looked deeply uncomfortable. Holden ignored her, his eyes still fixed on Caleb with a newfound malice. "So this is where you ended up," Holden mused. "Playing house with my wife, with my kids. You always were a sneaky one." He spat on the ground. "What happened, Preacher? Did you finally find your voice, or are you just good at fixing things you didn't break?" Just then, the screen door creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Holden's face transformed, the cruelty melting away into a sickeningly sweet smile. "Hey there, pumpkin. Daddy's home." Clara froze. Her gaze darted from the sneering man on the horse to the solid, quiet man standing in the yard. She looked at Holden's face, then at Caleb's. And then slowly, deliberately, she walked down the porch steps, past her mother, and went straight to Caleb. She wrapped her small arms tightly around his waist and buried her face in his coat. "This is my papa," she whispered, her voice muffled but clear. Holden's face darkened into a thunderous mask of rage, but Caleb's hand just rested protectively on Clara's head, his gaze never leaving Holden's. "She's made her choice," Caleb said, and his quiet words held more power than any shout. Holden's hand twitched towards his belt, but the sheriff cleared his throat loudly. "Now, Holden," the sheriff said, his voice firm. "You know the law. You abandoned them. You got no claim here. You want to fight this, you take it to a judge, but right now, you're trespassing." Holden glared at them, his eyes promising retribution. "This ain't over," he snarled, yanking on his horse's reins. He shot one last look at Caleb. "You'll regret this." He galloped away, the sheriff following after him with a grim, backward glance. They stood in the sudden silence, the dust settling around them. Clara was still clinging to Caleb's leg. Nora's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. A prison camp. The quiet, gentle man who had whittled toys for her children and mended her home had been a prisoner, and he had been imprisoned with Holden. She looked at Caleb, really looked at him. The scars on his knuckles she'd assumed were from work. The haunted look in his eyes she'd thought was just grief. It was all clicking into place, forming a picture that terrified her. "Caleb?" she whispered. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. "I'll tell you everything," he said, "but first, let's get the children inside." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat at the kitchen table. The only light was from a single candle, its flame dancing and casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. "I wasn't in for what you think," Caleb began, his voice low and strained. "It was debt. My wife. She got sick. The medicine, the doctors. I couldn't keep up. I owed the wrong man. He made an example of me." He stared down at his hands. Black Creek wasn't a prison. It was hell. And Holden, he was one of the devils who ran the place for the warden. He wasn't a guard. He was an inmate, but one of the trusted ones. He enjoyed the power. He enjoyed the pain. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. "The things I saw him do, Nora. The reason I stopped speaking was because words felt useless. They felt like lies. After what I saw, silence was the only honest thing left." He finally looked up at her. "When I got out, my wife was gone. I just started walking, fixing things. It was the only way I knew how to put the world back together, even a little piece of it. When I saw your fence, saw you and the children, it was the first time I felt like maybe there was a piece I could fix for good." Nora reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "He can't hurt us, Caleb." "He'll try," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He won't let this go. He doesn't see you or Clara as people. He sees you as possessions, and he thinks I stole you." He was right. 5 nights later, Nora woke to the sound of shattering glass. She shot upright in bed, her heart instantly pounding. In the other room, Caleb was already moving, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. She heard him grab the heavy axe he kept by the hearth. Another crash, this one louder, from the barn. A horse whinnied in terror. "Stay with the children!" Caleb's voice was a sharp command in the darkness. Nora scrambled out of bed, herding the sleepy, frightened children into the corner of the room, shielding them with her own body. Clara was sobbing into her shoulder. Outside she heard shouting, a man's enraged roar, Holden's voice, then the sickening thud of a struggle, then a terrifying silence. "Caleb!" she called out, her voice cracking with fear. No answer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. A minute felt like an hour. She couldn't just wait. She grabbed the old rifle from its place over the mantelpiece, her hands surprisingly steady. Taking a deep breath, she slipped out the back door, barefoot in the cold, damp grass. The barn door was swinging on one hinge. A flickering orange light spilled out from within. The smell of kerosene and smoke filled the air. She peered inside, her heart in her throat. Moonlight cut through the hayloft, illuminating a grim scene. Holden lay on the floor, a half-empty can of kerosene spilled beside him. A pitchfork was discarded nearby, and Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily, his face pale but resolute. "He had a torch," Caleb said, his voice ragged. "He was going to burn it down, with all of us inside." Nora's knees buckled. The rifle slipped from her grasp. She would have collapsed if Caleb hadn't crossed the distance in 2 quick strides and caught her, holding her upright. He held her tight, and she buried her face in his chest, the smell of wood smoke and sweat filling her senses. They were safe. For now. The sheriff arrived at sunrise, his face a grim mask. He didn't ask many questions this time. He just looked at the kerosene, the discarded torch, and the unconscious form of Holden being loaded onto a wagon. He looked at Caleb, then at Nora and the children huddled on the porch. "He won't be bothering you again," the sheriff said, and it was a promise. But safety wasn't a switch you could flip. The trauma lingered, a foul smoke that choked the air in the house. The children had nightmares. Nora found herself jumping at every creak of the floorboards. Caleb said little, but he worked tirelessly. He reinforced the doors, added new locks to the windows, and stacked wood by every entrance, building a fortress around them. One evening, after the fear had finally begun to recede, he came to her as she sat by the fire. He held out his hand. In his palm was a ring, carved from a single piece of pine, the grain swirling in a beautiful, intricate pattern. "I know you're not ready," he said, his voice soft. "But I needed to make it, to remind myself that some things don't have to be broken first to be real." She didn't say yes. She didn't say anything. She just wept. She took the ring and kept it in her apron pocket for days. She would hold it when the baby cried, when Clara asked for a story, when the wind howled and made her shiver. Then one morning, as the sun streamed through the kitchen window, she slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Caleb saw it. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. And in that moment, the house wasn't just a fortress anymore. It was a home. But life, Nora was learning, was a relentless series of tests. Just as they began to breathe again, a rider brought news from the valley. A fever. It was spreading fast. People were dying. Within a week, Daniel had a cough. By the end of the second day, Clara was burning up. The fever was a cruel thief. It stole the color from her children's cheeks, the light from their eyes. It stole their laughter and replaced it with weak, ragged coughs that tore at Nora's soul. She didn't sleep. She moved between their beds, a ghost in the lamplight, bathing their foreheads with cool cloths, murmuring prayers until her lips were chapped. Caleb was her rock. He brewed foul-smelling teas from herbs he gathered in the woods. He kept the fire roaring, building small cots for the children right beside the hearth so the warmth would seep into their bones. The baby, miraculously, remained untouched, cooing in her cradle as if she lived in a different world. But Daniel and Clara only got worse. The fever climbed, relentless and terrifying. One night, as Nora held a cup of water to Clara's lips, the little girl's breathing hitched. It stopped, just for a moment. An eternity. The world went silent. Nora's heart seized in her chest, but Caleb was there. His hands, which had been so strong against Holden, were impossibly gentle. He lifted Clara from her cot, rocking her as he had that first night in the woods. He whispered into her ear, his voice a low, desperate prayer. "Stay with me, little one. Stay with me. I fixed your fence. I can fix this, too. Just stay. And somehow she did. A shudder ran through her small body, and she took a ragged, gasping breath, then another. By morning, the fever broke. Both children were drenched in sweat, weak, but their eyes were clear. 2 days later, they were sitting up, demanding soup. Nora collapsed onto the floor beside their cots and wept. She wept for the fear, for the relief, for the man who had willed her daughter back to life. Caleb stepped outside into the cold, crisp morning air, fell to his knees in the dirt, and thanked a God he hadn't spoken to in years, his own tears blurring the sunrise. Love, it turned out, wasn't a grand declaration. It was quiet. It was a man carving toys by firelight. It was a woman wiping a fevered brow. It was a girl who called a man Papa, not because of blood, but because he had earned the title, nail by nail, prayer by prayer. As the land began to thaw, a fragile peace settled over the small farm. They had faced down ghosts and demons, sickness and violence. They had survived. Then, one afternoon, the boys found another letter by the gate. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. It was written on rough, tear-stained paper, from a woman with 5 children, abandoned and alone in a valley 2 towns over, begging for anyone to help. Caleb read it twice. His face was a mask of grim resolve. He looked at Nora, and in his eyes she saw the call of a kindred spirit, another broken thing that needed mending. She knew what he had to do, what they had to do. She just nodded. "Build another room," she said. And he did. The letter was a cry for help from a place Caleb knew all too well, a place of quiet desperation. The woman's name was Margaret Willoughby. Her husband, she wrote, had been swallowed by the bottle, and one day he just vanished, leaving her with 5 hungry mouths to feed and a mountain of debt. Her neighbors, she said, had already turned their backs. Nora watched Caleb's face as he read it aloud. She saw the familiar pain in his eyes, the echo of his own loss. "You don't have to go," she said softly, though she already knew his answer. He folded the letter carefully. "I think," he said, his voice low, "I think I already left the moment I finished reading it." The next morning he packed his satchel. He kissed the baby's forehead, a silent promise in the gesture. Nora walked with him to the gate, the one that had started it all. It felt like a lifetime ago. "What if you come back with 5 more children?" she asked, a faint smile playing on her lips. He tapped the axe strapped to his saddle. "Then I'll build a bigger house." He returned 2 days later, not on his horse, but leading it. Behind him was a rickety wagon, one wheel patched with rope and stubborn will. Inside, huddled under a thin blanket, was Margaret and her children. She was gaunt, her face drawn and pale, her eyes holding the glassy, haunted look of someone who had stared into the abyss for too long. Her children were silent, eerily so. They didn't cry or complain. They just stared out at the world with wide, empty eyes, as if they expected it to disappear at any moment. Nora was on the porch before the wagon even stopped. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She went to them. She helped the trembling Margaret down from the wagon. She ushered the children inside, where the smell of warm stew filled the air. She passed around bowls, her movements calm and reassuring. Clara, bless her heart, took one of the little girls by the hand. Daniel, without a word, offered the oldest boy his favorite carved bear, the one with the crooked legs. The house, which had once felt so big and empty, now strained at the seams. Nora moved her own bedroll to the floor to make room. Caleb took the rocking chair by the fire. The walls seemed to groan under the weight of so much life, but they held. They were stronger now. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Margaret barely spoke. Her children were like little ghosts, flitting through the house without making a sound. Caleb understood. He knew that some wounds needed silence to heal. You didn't fill the void with words. You just sat with it patiently until it softened on its own. Slowly, like hesitant spring buds, they began to open up. Margaret revealed she had been a teacher once, before marriage. She loved books, loved stories. Her children, seeing the kindness in Nora and the quiet strength in Caleb, began to thaw. The little ones started following Daniel around like he was their long-lost brother. The girls braided Clara's hair. They all sat in a circle at night, their faces upturned and rapt, as Caleb read to them, his voice a steady, low rumble. But Nora noticed a change, a subtle shift in the currents of the house. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on. It was in the small things. The way Margaret's eyes would follow Caleb as he worked. The way she seemed to understand his silences in a way that even Nora couldn't. There was a shared language of deep, profound pain between them. A language Nora was grateful she didn't fully comprehend. A seed of disquiet planted itself in her heart. She felt a distance growing between her and Caleb, a space that Margaret was unknowingly, unintentionally filling. She told herself it was just her imagination. She told herself she was being selfish. They were building a sanctuary here, a haven for the broken. That was what mattered. But the heart is not always rational. Then the sickness returned. It came for Margaret's children this time, with a vengeance that was terrifying. It was the same fever, but faster, harsher. Within a day, all 5 of them were burning up. The house became a makeshift hospital. Margaret, her face a mask of desperate terror, moved from cot to cot. Nora was right beside her, holding hands, wiping brows, her own heart aching with a familiar dread. Caleb was a pillar of strength, but even he seemed helpless against this onslaught. Then Jude, the youngest boy, stopped breathing. This time, Caleb didn't pray. He ran. He ran into the woods, his face wild with a grief and fury so potent it was terrifying to witness. He came back minutes later, his hands full of bark and herbs Margaret had once mentioned. A desperate long shot from a half-remembered conversation. It wasn't magic. It was a prayer made of bark and roots and a desperate man's will. He forced the tea between Jude's blue lips, and the boy stirred. He coughed. He opened his eyes, and he whispered a single, life-affirming word. "Papa." Caleb collapsed, his face in his hands, and sobbed. The next morning, all 5 of Margaret's children were alive. The fever had broken. Nora watched from the doorway as Margaret went to Caleb. She didn't hug him. She just placed a hand on his arm, and he looked up at her. The look that passed between them was one of profound, earth-shattering understanding. It was a look that went beyond friendship, beyond gratitude. It was the look of 2 halves of a shattered whole, finally finding each other. And in that moment, Nora knew. Caleb had come to fix her fence. He had mended her family. He had even mended her heart. But he wasn't meant for her. His path, his purpose, was to mend the truly shattered. And Margaret, who had lost everything, was more broken than Nora had ever been. The knowledge was a cold, sharp pain in her chest. But it was also, strangely, a relief. It was the truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, sets you free. The sanctuary Caleb was building wasn't just for her family. It was for all of them, and its foundation had just been laid. But the world outside the fence wasn't done testing them. A week later, another letter arrived. This one was not a plea. It was a threat. It was from Margaret's husband, and he was coming to take his children back. The letter was short, the handwriting a jagged scrawl. "I know where they are. You can't keep them." There was no signature, just a town name, Sutton Ridge, and a time. Sunday, at noon. Margaret's face drained of all color as she read it over Caleb's shoulder. "It's him," she whispered, her hands trembling. "I thought he was gone for good." "What does he want?" Nora asked, though she already knew the answer. Caleb folded the letter slowly, his expression grim. "He wants to take them back." "No," Margaret choked out, backing away from the table. "He can't. He sold them. He signed the papers. He didn't want them." "He might not care about what he said then," Caleb murmured, his eyes dark. "He might care about what it looks like now. People finding out you're all here, safe, and he's not a part of it. For a man like that, pride is all he has left." I can't lose them again, Margaret wept, her body shaking. I can't. You won't, Caleb said, and his voice was a promise forged in iron. The next few days were thick with a tense, unspoken dread. On Sunday morning, Caleb hitched the horse to the wagon. I'm going alone, he announced. No, Margaret and Nora said in unison. You need to be here, he said, his gaze locking with Margaret's. With them. He turned to Nora. And you need to be ready, just in case. Nora nodded, understanding the unspoken command. She went and got the rifle. Caleb left without another word. The ride to Sutton Ridge was long, the road a river of mud from the recent rains. He reached the town square just as the church bell was striking noon. The man was there, leaning against a rusted cart. He was cleaner than Caleb had expected, his hair slicked back with grease, but his eyes were hard and empty. You him? The man asked, squinting. Caleb nodded. I am. Don't look like much, the man sneered. I'm not much, Caleb agreed. Just enough. The man's eyes darted around, looking for Margaret. Where is she? Afraid to face me? She's faced enough, Caleb said, his voice flat. The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. Look, I ain't here for trouble. I just want what's mine. You lost the right to call them yours. They're my blood. Blood doesn't sell blood, Caleb said, stepping closer. The man's smile vanished. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Caleb reached into his coat, not for a weapon but for a sheaf of folded papers. This, he said, holding them out, is an affidavit, signed by Margaret. It details every time you hit her, every time you left the children hungry. It's witnessed by her neighbors from your last town. And this, he added, pulling out another paper, is the bill of sale for your 2 oldest children, which you signed over to the mill for drinking money. The man's face went white. I take these to the sheriff, Caleb said softly, and you won't just lose your children, you'll lose your freedom. The man lunged, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. But Caleb was ready. He didn't fight back, he simply stepped aside. The man, propelled by his own momentum, stumbled and fell face first into a large puddle of mud. He lay there, sputtering and cursing, defeated not by violence, but by the simple, unassailable truth. The sheriff arrived a few minutes later, drawn by the commotion. It didn't take long. Caleb rode home as dusk was falling. The porch light was on. Candles flickered in every window. He opened the door, and they were all there, waiting for him. Nora, Margaret, all 8 children. No one said anything. They didn't have to. Later that night, after the children were asleep, the 3 adults sat by the fire. The silence was comfortable, profound. Nora looked at Caleb, then at Margaret. She saw the unspoken love between them, the deep, soul-level connection forged in shared trauma and healing. There was no jealousy in her heart, only a quiet, bittersweet acceptance. She had been a bridge for them. Her broken fence had led Caleb here, and he, in turn, had led Margaret here. It was a strange and painful and beautiful circle. She stood up and went to the mantelpiece. She took down the pine ring Caleb had carved for her. She walked over to him and placed it in his hand. I think, she said, her voice clear and strong, this belongs to someone else now. Tears welled in Caleb's eyes. He looked at Margaret, whose own face was wet with tears. He took the ring, knelt before Margaret, and held it out. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered. The next morning, the bell by the gatepost rang, not in warning, but in celebration. Caleb was building another room onto the house, a bigger one. Spring had finally, truly arrived. The garden Nora had planted was bursting with life. The children, all 8 of them, ran barefoot in the grass, their laughter the sweetest sound in the world. Nora stood on the porch, the baby on her hip, watching them. Watching Caleb and Margaret work side by side, their movements synchronized, their silences full of love. She was whole, healed not by a man, but by the love that man had brought into her life. Her heart was no longer a broken thing needing to be fixed. It was a home, strong and resilient, with more than enough room for everyone. She had lost a husband, but she had found a family. A strange, patched-together, beautiful family, built on the foundations of a broken fence. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was a house that could withstand any storm. If you were moved by the story of this unconventional family, and you believe in the power of second chances, then do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other broken fences might lead to beautiful homes.